It's an honor to be a guinea pig.
So let's just do intros. Who are you? Tell me about yourself.
My name's Danny. I've been working in the games industry for about 10 years as a senior character artist.
I'm Matthew Keane. I'm a lead character artist in the games industry for 10 years now. What I wanted to chat about in this first podcast was crunch. And just the idea of crunch culture. Pretty much every single quadruple A title you can even think of has dealt with crunch in some way, shape, or form. How would you, as a game industry veteran, define crunch?
Crunch is the notion that you are working overtime and working long hours, usually sometimes 60, 70 weeks. Eight hours is a standard workday. You might be working 10, 12-hour workdays in order to push a project to completion, to get it gold. Crunch could be 3 months. Sometimes it can be 6 months. It could be even longer in some cases, rather famously, as we've seen in the news medias recently, is working with your teammates, usually, to help push your projects out the door, just to get it finished. And by no means, by talking about crunch in the video game industry, am I trying to disparage people who work overtime. The game industry just has a large issue with it, and there's a high turnover rate for games industry staff because essentially they get burnt out and they leave the industry. Not many people work in the industry longer than I think the math was something like 6-7 years. So you have these passionate individuals who are, entering all bright-eyed and smiles into the industry, and then they just get burned out and they're churned through, and then they leave the industry, and then it's cyclical because there's like so many people willing to kind of bear the burden of crunch, as opposed to changing it. Nothing needs to change.
I mean, I think for someone who's outside of the game space, I could easily see why, just at a passing glance, on the sheer scale of some of these games and the sheer scope and the amount of stuff they're cramming into it for that $60, now maybe $70 price tag for some of these next-gen titles, I can totally understand why someone would look at that and say, yes, artists need to compound themselves and give up personal time and sacrifice themselves for their craft. The one thing that frustrates me is the disregard of the human factor. So as someone purchasing that title for $60, $70, to think that price tag justifies the amount of man hours that went into it is kind of absurd.
Yeah, I don't see it as a necessity at all. And I think it's folly to say that it is. I think it purely comes down to bad planning and bad project planning. And I think that's why crunch exists. I don't think that needs to happen, especially not if people are suffering physically and mentally during that process.
There's almost in some ways too much freedom, I find, given to that, finding the fun factor in a game. And what you end up having is, over the course of maybe 2 or 3 years, you're in actuality making 2 or 3 different types of games. And once you realize what you're making, you're too late to either you ask for more time, and then that kind of, burns through whatever budget you had for post-release content, what have you. Or you just ask your entire team to say, hey, we need to now make up this time somehow. And that means, guess what, everyone, you don't have weekends anymore, or we're asking you to stay late, and we're going to buy you a $10 dinner to make up for you committing yourself for.
I've eaten a lot of pizza and Italian food at the office. In the past, that's always been the way that they get you.
Most expensive meal you're ever going to eat. For any game dev watching right now who enjoys crunch food, we're not knocking you for that, but just do yourself a favor and do the math real fast. I want you to take your salary. I want you to divide it down and get your hourly rate. You break it down to your hourly rate for what you're making on that salary, and then think about how often you spend after work to work to earn that crunch food. That 2 or 3 hours, multiply that by your hourly rate. That's how much that slice of pizza is costing. That is the most expensive slice of pizza you're ever gonna have.
It's crazy. To go back to your point, actually, regarding the perception of whether or not the cost of a game is worth it, I think there's something to be said about the value of, or the public value of, art in video games. I do think that a lot of people perceive art to be a painful exercise. People who aren't artists kind of think artists suffer and squallow in pain before actually being able to actually develop anything of worth. They don't really understand what commercial art is. When people think of an artist, they think of Van Gogh cutting his ear off and then painting and being miserable, as opposed to people making a living acting as commercial artists. And so I think a lot of people justify, and I have seen this before, particularly emblematic of everyone's perception of a crunch, but I do think that certain gamers or people who consume video games expect that to be the norm. They expect it to be the norm that somebody who is passionate about something will issue every other part of their life out the window. The industry does, in a way, devalue people working in it by doing things like buying them pizza or buying them Italian food without actually compensating them for overworking, essentially. Yeah. It's like a problem that is compounding on itself now. I don't think there's any one way out, really, without kind of moving forward in unison.
Do you think there is a way for studios that potentially historically relied on crunch to make these titles? Like, say I'm an executive producer, or I'm a lead producer, or something like that, and I'm thinking about crunch, and I'm starting a new project, or I'm starting a new thing, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to basically be project owner here. I've seen my studio historically, crunch and all these other things. What's maybe something that they could do, or maybe the team could do, to try to alleviate some of that necessity for crunch?
I don't think it's enough just to not do crunch. I think you have to actively discourage it from happening. Artists are inherently, we're very passionate people, right? I don't think there's such a thing as an unpassionate or kind of passive artist. We want to do our best, we want to make things sparkly and shine, but sometimes you just have to do enough for the game. You don't have to kill yourself to get things in the game. It's great to be passionate, but I think there is a selfishness to certain kinds of developers, and it's not a bad thing, because we all want to do our best, but we have to realize as a whole how the ways in which we work with our peers in the industry can have a knock-on effects to their production. Because someone working on a team might have 2 kids, they might not be able to put in extra hours, they might be a single parent, whereas someone like me, I can just walk to work, come home, and then just keep working if I want to, right?
It's important, I think, to anyone who's heading up a project. Discouraging crunch is almost as important in some ways as, planning properly and making sure that everything is done well and within a budget, right? You can have a project, and that kind of falls into the idea of mandatory crunch versus, voluntary crunch, right? And so you'll have a lot of studios that potentially say, hey, we don't require crunch here. You'll talk to them and be like, we never request crunch, or the key word here is we've never mandated crunch before. Right?
Yeah.
And what that means is not necessarily that they don't crunch. It's that they don't request formally crunch, but there's a potential there for studio culture to inadvertently encourage crunch behavior and that sort of thing.
Hey, we bought you some pasta. We got you some pizza.
Exactly.
We'll just put it down here for you.
Exactly. You tend to find people, especially in our industry, especially with the personalities in our industry, potentially taking it a little too far, and they commit themselves too much to a thing that is really in actuality not theirs. When you're making artwork for a game, that's the game and that's the studio's artwork. That isn't yours.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. And there's a real importance there to differentiate the two. If you want to work all weekend on your own personal piece and making that as cool as you can be, 100%, please do so. But if you're in a studio setting and you're earning money, you're earning a salary, you're getting paid for your work, and you've put in the time allotted for your time, you shouldn't feel bad, basically, about saying, hey, I've worked a full day. I'm going to go home now and do my own thing. Yeah. And I think it's important, if you're a lead or a sub-lead or any sort of a managerial structure or any sort of arm on a team that sort of helps facilitate maybe asset creation or game creation on that team side, to be incredibly wary of that. That even though you may not have a studio mandating crunch, please be very wary and very visible with how implications may be had by how a producer may say something or how a director may say something, or is it implied that this quality bar needs to be lifted? From my own perspective, it does a lot of times fall to the people that are interacting and interfacing directly with the artists and the engineers direct. So it will be on the lead level where this is sort of really important. If you have someone killing themselves to really sort of have them slow down a little bit, but also in the flip side of it, manage expectations in the upwards motion as well, managing up. And if you feel that there is something happening that is vague or unclear or is potentially pushing the team towards crunch, to be incredibly vocal about it and to speak to production and involve production in a way that is early on and early enough that they can potentially do something about it. The leads in a lot of ways aren't responsible though for crunch in that regard.
Naturally. Yeah.
I do feel it is a failing of both clear planning. I feel that crunch is a sort of a symptom among other things. This industry need for games getting bigger and larger and wider and almost never ending and that sort of thing. And I'm not against large titles or 100+ hour games, but if you're going to do a project like that, you can't just go into it blind. You have to really understand the human impact that a project like that will have on your team, and maybe not being afraid to scope back for the sake of your team. I feel like there is a lot of honor in a lot of respect, at least I will give a studio if they say, hey, this scope of this project has just gone far beyond what our team can comfortably do. So maybe, hey, maybe we need to scope this back. Maybe we need to make a more refined project that doesn't kill everyone to do, that allows us to maintain a level of happiness, and yet still allows us to maintain also a quality bar that everyone could be proud of and things like that. So that when the game does eventually ship, one, we have a team that's like really satisfied with the product that they made because they feel like they've done something. Last thing you want is things to be cut at the very end, and therefore you felt like you failed, like you didn't make it in. So if things are cut early and cut honestly, then you don't have team regret in that way. So you end up with a happier team, but then you also end up with a team that isn't burnt out. And, you and I have experienced like burnout on these projects, and it's not fun, and it's incredibly hard to come back from. Like when you have a whole team that is burnt out and that has given everything they got to a project. Successful, the way game models usually work is once that game is done, guess what? You're ramping up the next project. And that ramp up time is going to get longer and longer and longer if you just keep constantly burning out the people working on these projects, whether it's through their own voluntary methods or you're mandating that people crunch. So being very wary of that personal factor is incredibly important, I think.
I 100% agree, and I think you've raised an interesting point there, in that I think the cost of games now is a problem of growth, because we are setting larger expectations each year, and that's not to say that what we've done in the industry is bad. Like I think we have some of the best looking games we've ever had in recent years, and some of the most interesting, innovative titles. However, when we are just kind of growing and swelling, I think the issue of crunch, especially, because it is becoming normalized and it is becoming something that is expected in the industry, there is going to be an even larger and very real human costs to making video games, because people are going to get burnt out, but more people are going to get burnt out each year because we are expecting larger growth in the industry. Yeah. I mean, I think it was even just a few days ago when Blizzard said they need to hire about 1,000 people to meet up with expectations. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I agree. I almost would even say that a lot of times, too, you'll find these studios that do these ramp up, these hiring sprees where they'll just hire on a ton of people for a project, where in reality, had that project just been organized a little bit better or managed a little bit better, you might have not needed 20 new people to basically make this project. You could have maybe done it with 10 and just had a much clearer thing. And the fact that we are still such a new industry, the fact that we're still so young as an industry in the games industry, there's no books written on this stuff. I mean, there are, but there's not many, like we're still kind of flying by the seat of our pants a lot of times. And so you have these projects that are these gigantic behemoth things that are not as well organized as they could be. You have people in positions they're cast in these positions that maybe they're not the most prepared for. And You have this unorganized thing that is expected to organically change as this project goes. Producers who maybe aren't the best at understanding what these small level changes will add up to. And then you have an art team and an engineering team that are told that they're doing something that no one's ever done before and that it's expected that they commit themselves. And you have this sort of broken system basically that relies on the fact that people are willing to be very loyal to these studios and maintain this professionalism, even though they're basically like giving away all of their personal free time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it also kind of like talking about the artistic aspect again, not so much just talking about artists working in the industry, but you're ultimately devaluing the crafts in a way because you're essentially doing free work. And that's, if you're good at something, never do it for free. And that's not to say that like we won't be coerced into doing it, because we will be, because we're passionate and we want to be part of the team and we want to experience that camaraderie and we want to see our project out the door. You will be paid as little as you can be paid, and that is essentially also true when we're discussing crunch culture.
Yeah.
Because people are largely not paid overtime. You have your salary and you're given a slice of pizza or two.
Yeah.
To kind of join in on the fun during crunch times.
Also, to that point, do not define yourself by your job, which is something that in the games industry is very difficult to do. You'll find, especially in studio structures, there is somewhat of you could almost call it tribalism in some ways. Like, I'm part of this team or I'm part of this structure. And what tribalism breeds in a lot of ways is this sort of unwavering commitment to this project, to this idea. And eventually you might not catch it in time, and you might have gone maybe too far into this project and created unhealthy habits within yourself that are going to take a lot of time to undo. I speak from experience with that, where, there were times where I let a project affect me go too far in that vein, and it caused issues in myself personally that I had to really work on to undo, whether that be unhealthy habits, terrible sleep patterns, the view of myself professionally, all of that stuff. Like, crunch in many aspects, even if it's like a positive thing where you can see like positive change happening, even if it's positive, crunch has an odd effect mentally on you as a person and as an artist, because you're basically saying that this job that you're doing, that you're being paid to, you are valuing it personally over time spent with friends, time spent with family, and time spent with your own personal growth. And nothing is worth more than that. Like, nothing. Yeah. I mean, no job should ever be valued over your own personal growth and personal time, in my opinion.
I've never seen a Christmas movie where someone has ignored his family and friends and other pursuits, and then it has been happy. You know?
Right.
I've never experienced that kind of ending to a movie or story.
The spirits never went to Scrooge and was like, "Nah, don't change anything. You're good. Just keep
crunch."
Yeah, keep working for Christmas. It's all good. And they all lived happily ever after.
So ever since I've worked in games, the environment I've worked in has always been the same, like 3x3 desks, almost packed in by sardines. You're surrounded by computers and halogen bulbs, and with little natural light. It's not a fun environment to work overtime in. I don't think we really know what the physical implications are of crunch in the industry yet, because it's only really been happening for the past 20 years or so.
We're seeing it now in a grander scale with work from home. The world is dealing with something mentally that they've never had to deal with before, and this idea of isolation and dealing with screens all the time. And you're seeing the effects. I mean, it's blatant. People are tweeting about it and writing about it. It's sort of COVID depression kind of thing. And when you're constantly locking yourself off in a studio repeatedly throughout the whole day, not taking a break from that, you become a wet noodle, because you're seeing the same stuff repeatedly over and over again. You become blind to the things that are right in front of you. Having crunched, I got some benefits out of it in terms of like cool looking artwork, but were the benefits worth, in some cases, the the lasting effects, I'll say, mentally and physically that crunch gave me, I don't know. I really don't. Like, had I taken that same amount of time that I crunched and maybe reinvested it into myself or into my relationships or into the people around me, would that have been more worthwhile? Yeah, you could absolutely say that. And you're not getting that time back. I've repeatedly had found myself in situations where I've had to crunch in some ways that the results are always the same. Where, like, yeah, you feel great for a week or so after it because the game got out the door and everyone's happy. But then, this weird emptiness kind of sets in.
Yeah,
Games
yeah,
should
yeah.
not make up like this job that we're doing should not make up a majority of our life. Like, we cannot define ourselves by it. It's not like a relationship. This shouldn't feel like a breakup when a game is done. I feel like there are better. It doesn't matter what the project is. This could be the greatest game in the world that you're working on, and yeah, maybe you want to commit yourself more. Go for it, but don't make it your life.
That's something else I was thinking about in regards to the attrition of crunch as well. It's like running a marathon, right? That's kind of what making a game should be. But if things keep getting delayed, instead you're sprinting as opposed to taking it easy and, like, looking after your energy levels. You're going as fast as you can towards the target, but that finish line just keeps getting moved. I can only imagine if that were to happen on a project I was crunching on, I would not be very happy because I would be a husk. Like, I would be overworked and I would, being told, hey, we're going to crunch until this date, and then that's it. Then that keeps moving and it keeps moving and it keeps moving, and it can't be a good thing.
I think having it publicly happen like it's happening is maybe unprecedented. There are projects that have behind the scenes have been delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, having it happen publicly in prime time is obviously not the most ideal thing for that team and for that project. And what it is exposing, though, I think, is even with these larger titles, even with these like huge quadruple A things, you will find misorganization and misunderstanding, right? Like, the film industry went through a ton of changing and undulating in terms of policies and how they manage things and organizational things and how studios functioned and how they all ran. And we're just getting into that now in the games industry. What I'm hoping is that enough studios are seeing the negative reaction, at least from the industry, to these projects that are crunching, and will attempt to course correct and try to make sure that whatever projects they have coming up are either have enough people there that are managed well, or that are simply just smaller projects that don't require so much additional time in terms of man hours. I think that the public would probably be just as happy accepting a smaller, more polished title with then additional content later on to add on to it. So that way you have sort of at the end a much larger scale product, but you're also not killing your team to do it.
I remember when DLC and like kind of DLC packs around like Mass Effect 2 time, Mass Effect 3, when the kind of character packs and stuff like that, not skins, but the downloading an extra character for your team or whatever. People were quite upset about that at the time, like at least kind of gamers online on like things like old image boards and such like that, old forums, because they would kind of like harken back to, do you remember when you bought the game and then you just had the game? Like that kind of idea.
Yeah.
I think people do think that they're being trickle-fed content now. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing for them, I'm not sure. But I know that some people don't like it.
I get that. I there is that idea and floating idea of player value and wanting to make sure that people are feeling like they get their money's worth. I do feel, though, that player value needs to balance out with company value and team value. And right now we're in this weird sort of point in the industry where a lot of the money, and these games make a lot of money. Like, let's be very clear. I think the movie and TV industry combined right now and it's crazy. So we're talking massive amounts of money that I don't necessarily feel like maybe is balanced to the amount of money being paid to the employees that are crunching. Obviously, you hear about these, huge bonuses sometimes or things like that. And that does happen every so often on certain projects. But I would argue that's more of the exception, not the rule. And especially with how commonplace crunch is, I would definitely put money on the fact that the amount of crunch that's happening is not necessarily mitigated by these magical bonuses and things like that are happening in the industry on these certain titles, and that there are many people that are crunching on projects, maybe even currently, that potentially may not see the light of day, or will see the light of day, maybe make a ton of money, but won't necessarily find that money in their own pockets, and yeah, and at the end of the day, how that pie breaks down, may not always be completely in your favor. And if something doesn't go completely well, usually the ones that are the first to go are the ones that are the ones crunching to make sure these games are getting out the door. Those that are crunching are also the ones that are potentially seen as the most expendable in a production cycle.
That's actually, you raised two really good points there. We can literally afford to burn them out because we can replace them,
Right.
either with interns or with people who have a little less experience. People can justify hiring people to replace people who have been burned out, as opposed to looking after the staff who have been burnt out. And that's why people leave the industry. That's why we have such a high turnover rate. Secondly, so someone described to me the notion of the golden handcuff a few weeks ago, and I thought it was very interesting. So the notion
What's
of the
golden handcuff? Yeah.
It's a it doesn't sound as salacious as it is.
Okay.
It's the notion that when you're working on when you're crunching on a project and you're promised, hey, the bonuses at the end of this project will be great, so just stick with it and everything will be okay. That person might want to leave the company and find a better job, maybe even move to a smaller company, somewhere with less crunch. But if they've given so much of themselves to this project already, and they've just been told that they have 6 months of crunch just to get through it, then they're kind of held back from leaving, because that paycheck, that bonus, is just kind of 6 months out of sight. They're bound in place by the golden handcuff. So essentially, that's what kind of forces people or persuades people to stay at a company for a certain amount of time, or to stay until the project is done, so they'll get that juicy package. And sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes they don't get it, and it really does suck.
With the amount of games that we don't know about that don't make it out the door, I would probably say that a majority of the time that probably doesn't happen.
Yeah, you're right, man.
One of the things that I've at least always told junior artists starting into the industry is set these healthy habits early and keep them consistent. Please clock out at the end of the day and take a break. If you have a really good lead and you have a really good producer and you have a really good studio setup, they'll bake that into the production so that they'll make sure you're not overworking yourself. If you're a lead and you're watching this and you have juniors on your team, like we said before, please be very wary of that, because the initial feeling from a lot of people, especially coming right out of school, you're taught in art school to constantly commit yourself and crunch and work out to get projects done. Yeah. And it does create this very unhealthy relationship with work. So then you go into the studio, having done that as a student, expecting the same thing. And the truth is, you do that for 10 years straight, you're going to be health-wise, it's going to really affect you.
There is a certain breed of kind of toxicity regarding the selfishness of kind of wanting to be the best or develop yourself during personal crunch. You and I are both guilty of that, right? We've both kind of done that in our past. But it can cause other people to have that guilt, and then they will overwork as well. I've seen that happen before.
Absolutely.
And it's hard, because sometimes people will just say, okay, I can justify this because I would be doing art at home if I wasn't doing this. So I'll just do more art here. I'll do another 4 hours a night. And then that way, it's not like I'm losing time. But then your colleagues, they might not be able to give themselves in the same way that you are to the game. And again, doing that causes all sorts of issues in terms of production. One person is then spending an unrealistic amount of time on an asset. Production will then look at it and say, like, why does this look like this, and why does everything else not look as good?
That will throw an entire pipeline into flux, because expectations are not being set. You're absolutely right. If you have a person who is secretly crunching every night to get characters looking the way they do, and a producer looks at that and says, oh, well, in 2 weeks, you got a whole thing done, that is now expectations for the rest of the team. Or like you said, it creates friction. No one's going to be impressed, especially on a team level, if you crunch and falsify your time on an asset. Like it doesn't impress anyone, especially because the expectation is then you maintain that. Not going to put this on producers either. Producers are a part of the reason why crunch happens, but producers a lot of times are only working with the numbers and estimates that the team themselves are giving them. So it's a whole, we're all guilty of it. Like I remember when they were talking about Mass Effect and Mass Effect Andromeda and that sort of thing, how they called it that BioWare magic. They weren't sure what was going on, but at the end, it's somehow all balanced out, and that was true until it wasn't, and eventually that check came due and no one on the team was able to cash it. And it's a reality. People are a resource that can be depleted if you're not careful, and when you've depleted that resource, it takes so much more work to build it back up again than it would if you just maintained it the entire time.
Yeah, 100%. It's a large proponent of crunch, and that we need to try and look after the people working in the industry. I think right now the current paradigm in which we're kind of developing games pushes us towards the notion that everyone wants to break new frontiers. Everyone wants to make the best project. I mean, hell yeah, we all do. But at the same time, we have to do it in a way that's sustainable. And I think we're not making sustainable games. We're making games that are bad for the environment, And I think this is something we need to try and solve as an industry, because in time there aren't going to be any 50-year-old game developers in 20 years,
right?
Because we'll all just be burnt out,
And it's a shame, because I think it's a fixable problem. With this new frontier of games comes almost an opportunity that you didn't get before, where can you now do it right this time, basically? Like, can we take the lessons we learned from the previous generation? Like, you almost have an endpoint now, which is great. You have this cap from the PS4, Xbox One generation. And with that comes what I hope to see is studios maybe revisiting pipelines finally as they make things next gen. If you're not doing this too, I wholeheartedly implore you to do so. If you have a chance to revisit your pipeline, especially for next gen, please, please, please look at your crunch practices. Don't even think of it in terms of crunch. Look at your overtime practices. Try to, as best as you can, bake that into the pipeline. If you're a director, please be receptive to that kind of stuff too. A small feature to you that might be quick on paper could potentially cost an individual weekends and time away from their families. And especially now that we've all have been experiencing this weird quarantine and work from home, it's more important now than ever to make sure that the people that are on your team are taking care of themselves.
It is going to be interesting to watch us go back to the office once all this is over, because I think it's going to be easier to justify contacting someone on the weekend or doing things, doing work at home on the weekends or doing work at home in the evening, as opposed to staying at the office, right? So there will be more kind of secret crunch.
Yeah.
When people come home and they're like, oh, well, I'm at the computer anyway, I could just do a few hours of work. And I think that's something we do need to watch out for. There's more to life than doing your job, right? Like there really is. Like, I literally opened up Substance Painter yesterday with my work projects, and I was like, oh, I'll just change some values for a while, and then I was like, no, I'm going to open up ZBrush instead and do my own thing, because this is not like, I still enjoy doing art. I love doing art at home. It's been more difficult these days, but I do like kind of still try. That temptation is still there, and it's so ingrained into me. And I would justify it in my head, and I have to actively dismantle it and force myself not to do it.
Oh yeah,
it's a hard thing to do and a hard thing to unlearn.
Where we're dealing with a lot of this stuff for the first time. I think you and I were just talking about the other day, like how new retirement is to the games industry and things like that, and how people don't even know what it is to actually retire from this industry. It's a new concept, and it's crazy. It's crazy to think about that. People are starting to get to that point where they're like, yeah, I'm going to leave the industry to retire. And it's just like, huh?
Yeah.
It's
leaving?
crazy.
Why?
Yeah, I know. It's crazy.
Pick up
But
your whack on, man.
right,
Go on.
exactly.
Get back to work.
It's like the Viking death. You die with the Wacom pen in your hand. You know?
Like Vader's funeral, yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's an interesting point as well, actually, because all we're doing is like sitting down, and you're going to be tempted to do more work. I think it's something that we need to kind of like actively work together towards changing. It's not something that one company or one person will do. There is a kind of like oh come on, we're all in this together, and there's a sense of camaraderie there, wherein like if you're not with it, then you're against the notion of the game, or you're against like you're not with the team.
It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. I feel like these studios in some ways aren't going to learn not to do this until it gets put in front of them and like shown that this is a bad thing, that fans do not react well to this. If you really do enjoy a game that you know had a lot of personal sacrifice and a lot of personal things that, you know, happened on that team, maybe you yourself as a consumer be vocal about it. Express that you loved the title and you loved the, you know, end product, but you did not love the practices that it took to make said product. I think that it will have a huge impact on how a lot of studios view some of these structures, because it all comes down to money to them. If they know that they can make a successful title that people will buy without burning people out, they'll do it. If they know that by burning people out, people won't buy the game, they won't do it. You know, and it's
Exactly.
it's a really simple thing. You know,
It really is. I actually made the joke a while back, and this is a terrible idea, but putting like almost like a free range game developer sticker on the cover art for, you know what I mean? Like when you buy eggs, I feel better when I buy free range eggs because I know the chickens have had a little hutch to walk around.
yeah.
And it's a free range game.
Yeah.
The game developer's got some fresh air. They only work 9 till 6.
Exactly.
You know?
These developers had a window in their office, and they had
Exactly. And fresh water.
fresh water.
Yeah. I'm being facetious, but like, yeah, I think that there are things we could do as an industry as a whole to make it a better place, and I think that's by and large for a lot of reasons. But I think like just it's true for crunch as well, which is what we're obviously talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Danny, if they wanted to find out more about you, where would they look?
So you can find me on ArtStation. On ArtStation, I'm artstation.com/DANNSW. It's a truncation of my name. And I'm on Twitter as well, which is maybe text below
Yes,
me right now.
it'll be there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Hey guys, I just wanted to thank you for watching episode 1 of the Keanstream. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to Danny Sweeney for being my guinea pig on this first one. He'll be in another one coming up, and I also have a few more of these planned. Thank you for listening, and I really hope to see you in the next one.